Hi, this is John at Airborne Innovations. I wanted to talk about U.f.l connectors. These are the tiny RF connectors you see on small RF gear, such as our Picoradio products. We've talked to a few people who had questions about them. This might seem like one of those obvious topics. Everyone knows what they are and how to use them, but we've run into a few things that are maybe not quite so obvious. I've definitely heard criticism about them before, such as they have a low cycle failure time, will they last, or that they're difficult to insert and remove. I've been using them for a long time, so I'd like to hopefully add my take to that. So these are really quite tiny and can carry a lot of RF power in a small amount of space, but they definitely aren't designed to be attached and detached repeatedly on a day-to-day basis. That is probably pretty obvious. If you look at the spec sheet on these, you'll see that they are typically rated to about 30 cycles. In our experience, though, the side that fails after a relatively low number of cycles is the cable side. And this can become pretty obvious. Essentially, what happens is the retention force on the cable reduces pretty dramatically after not too many cycles. Whether it's more than 5 to 10, I haven't really tried to determine, but that's probably about where it is based on what we've seen. We've not seen really any significant wear failures on the PCB connector side. You can get a feel for this, and my advice is if the retention force starts to reduce significantly, replace the cable side. Usually this is just a pigtail to another connector like RP-SMA, which is what these are. So if the force gets too low, just toss it. It's not worth messing with. What I'd also urge is not to attempt to reinforce or use any kind of glue, shoe goo, or epoxy or anything in an attempt to hold the connector on. There's a high chance you're going to end up getting the glue inside the connector on the PCB side, and then you're in for real trouble. We've seen people do this, and at that point I would consider the connector to be essentially ruined. Maybe some kind of solvent could remove it, but that might cause more trouble somewhere else. We've seen it done, and it's not worth it. The retention force of a cable with 5 cycles or less on it is quite high and will withstand large accelerations with no problem. And it's probably good to more than that. But you can get a feel for the amount of force we're talking about. And if it starts to get less, just replace the pigtail. Here's an example. This pigtail has been on our Picoradio test rig for some time, so it goes through quite a few cycles. If I gently lift one side of the cable, I can remove it quite easily, and when I put it on, I can hardly feel any force. This is something I would definitely call not flight worthy. Time to replace. So here's a new one. I'm going to get it right out of the bag. Let's compare the force. Let me grab one right out of this brand new bag here, and if I plug it in, get it aligned and pop it on, it actually makes a satisfying click, and you can see it has a lot of retention force. So that's really a new cable. What a new cable does for you. I would say also don't ever try to put one of these on while the radio is powered up. It's very easy to short the RF and ground together, and there's a pretty good chance you'll destroy a radio. Just don't do it. It's not worth it. So let's talk about insertion and removal technique. You just saw me do it, but like anything, it's something you can get a feel for. I think there's a tendency to use too much force when doing this because it takes a while to get a feel. I think the most critical thing while inserting is really to just get accurate alignment. If you try to push down while you don't have alignment, you can damage the cable side and possibly the PCB side. What really helps, I think, is looking closely at it while you're aligning it. If you're like me and your eyes don't focus too closely like this, you can get a headband magnifier. I use the one Adam Savage mentioned in a video on his channel. I'll leave a link in the description. If I'm wearing my glasses instead of my contacts, I can just take them off for super close nearsighted vision. It's better than a microscope. So just align it visually if possible and press down gently. You can get a feel for the alignment and when it's in place. If you hold it in the center without pressing down and try and move it around a little, you can get a feel for when it's in place. When you do push it down, it shouldn't need much force at all, and you hear a satisfying click. If it takes too much force, you're probably misaligned. Okay, now removal. The first thing is you should never need a tool to do this. don't use a screwdriver. The best way I know is to hold the cable next to the connector, hold on to the metal stiffener built into the connector end, and just gently rotate and rock the cable away from the PCB, up and away until it pulls away. We're not talking about a big angle. It's probably something like 20 to 30 degrees before the cable will pop off. Again, you shouldn't really need a lot of force to do this, and it's possible to damage a connector on the PCB, especially if you're using tools or something. If the connector is buried in a narrow slot, like it is on the microhard motherboard, you may need to do something else. Still, I would avoid using tools directly on the U.f.L connector. If you have to remove the radio module, I would do that first instead of removing the RF cable. It's just too restricted in that narrow space to do what needs to be done. You can insert it in there. It's not perfect. In my opinion, the socket needs a bit of a design modification for that to work well. So while I'm at it, I'll show you my technique for removing the radio modules from the socket. You need a thin screwdriver and, again, a bit of care. You need to remove the retention clip if it's there. It's easy to damage one of the parts on the board or jam a screwdriver tip into your finger if you're not careful. And you're probably going to damage a little bit of the plastic on one of the clips on the side of the socket getting it off. That's not really a big deal. It should still have plenty of retention force when it clips back on. Then, once you have it off, you start on the side of the radio, not at the corners. You can pry up one side of the radio a bit, then move on to another side. Then move on around the radio until it's far enough to get the screwdriver tip into a corner. Then you should be able to lift it out. Just note the orientation also. The RF connectors are on the board edge. Then, once you get the module out, you can remove the RF connector. That's my method. I'm not saying it's the only or correct way, but that's where experience has led me. Anyway, thanks for watching, and see you next time.